And I want to officially welcome everyone to our webinar in May, the next of our Pinsight in Practice series, our series of webinars that are built very much for users of Pinsight to understand the best practices, hear from other practitioners, and to get good tips and tricks and guidance into making good use out of the tools. Today, I want to thank everyone for joining us from a snowy but springtime day in Denver, Colorado, which is where Amy and Andrew and I are joining you from. But I also know that many of you are joining from around the world. Just looking at the participation list, I can see we've got folks from South Africa, from Turkey, from all the way down in Colorado Springs, I think perhaps. But I know there's many folks coming in. So if I think I've got a couple coming in from Italy. Oh, wouldn't that be delightful to see Italy right now? So it's lovely to have you here along today and joining us for this session. Today's session will be about the newest feature on our platform. And as many of you know, we strongly value the power of data in Pinsight to bring about fair and equitable and high quality decisions when it comes to talent. And that's what today will all be about, introducing you to the exciting updates that we have for the platform. So from a housekeeping perspective, we are recording this session to make sure that we can push out the link to you and your colleagues for those that didn't quite get there today. We'll also be hosting this webinar on our resources page on our website. So please check over there in the next couple of days. And we will be making sure that this is widely available. We have some members of the team joining us on the chat there today. So if you've got any questions specifically, Andrew can help you out there over in the chat. But of course, as we go along, you are welcome to use the Q&A button if you want Amy or my attention to answer any questions. And of course, at the end of the session, if we don't have those questions answered for you, we'll be happy to follow up with you and make sure you get all the details that you need. I think those are the important pieces. So let's just jump into the introductions and who's talking to you today. You hopefully, I know many of the list of names there, and it's lovely to see you. My name's Michelle Brown. I'm the COO with Pinsight. It's my great pleasure to spend some time with you, wearing the, I guess, the practitioner hat along with you all today. And I'm joined by the delightful Amy Huber, our talent consultant, who will be wearing a little bit of the science and practitioner hat with us as well. And Amy and I are absolutely thrilled to be with you this morning. And as you can see in the chat, Andrew Coulter, our talent consultant, or I should say our client advisor, is also in the chat box there, ready to answer any immediate questions that you have. And you're welcome to use the chat there. Maybe a little bit tricky for Amy and I to just monitor that chat. So that's why we have Andrew along there. All right, so jumping into our agenda today, some of the things that we wanted to reorient you to is some of the mission and values of Pinsight. For those that are joining us and are new to Pinsight, we'll just get a quick reorientation to what we do and how we're doing it. And then we'll jump right into the world of talent analytics. So we'll be just spending a few minutes on what sort of analytics are important and powerful to drive fair and equitable decisions in organizations. And then we'll get into the meat of our topic today, which is to talk about some of the changes that have been introduced into the Pinsight platform in the last few days. These are some great additions and updates, which we really have built with the hope that you'll be able to find power and insight and great opportunities for intervention for improving organizational effectiveness and organizational development. That's where we'll spend the bulk of the time today. We do want to show you a practical application, a case, if you will, and how we have started to experiment with some of these analytics earlier this year. And so I'll talk to you a little bit about a case that we did and use some different data to think about talent and how that drove some very different interventions than we might have originally anticipated. And then we'll finish up with some practical takeaways and next steps. But of course, if there's any other important information that we don't get to today, please do make sure that you reach out to myself, Amy, or Andrew, or anyone on our team to get those important questions answered. All right, so that's a little bit about what we're going to cover. So let's just jump in and start thinking about Pinsight as a whole. For those that are new to us, our key mission is to bring fairness to leader selection, development, and succession. We want to level the playing field for leaders to give them the best opportunity to show what they're made of, but also to unlock their potential and become the strongest leaders they can be by using high quality evidence and data in important succession, selection, development decisions. As you can see on the left-hand side there, one of our core values in Pinsight is evidence. We believe that it's critically important to bring data into the conversation when starting to make these key decisions about which leaders will take what roles, how leaders are developed, which leaders are developed and in what fashion, and which leaders are ready to take the helm. We know, and I'm sure all of you've had the experience, that you don't have to get too far deep into the newspaper or into the news feed, if you will, to see how critical leaders are in the effectiveness and success of our organizations, our teams, our individual lives as employees, our economy, and our community and societies at large. So we believe that investing in leaders with high quality data is absolutely critical. And that's really what led us to make these updates and changes so far. When it comes to the history of Pinsight, the three things that we have really been investing in when it comes to our pillars is that we've been really putting into place a combination of high technology solutions combined with behavioral sciences. And so it's this combination, this blend or collaboration of high-powered technology with deep evidence-based behavioral science that has meant in the last 13 years that we've been operating, we've wanted to bring high-powered assessment to the world of talent and data analytics. And so for those that haven't met with us before or talked much about who Pinsight is, we've really specialized into the world of having very effective and scalable assessments to be able to enable good quality leader selection decisions. We've taken that data and converted it into a means where leaders can get highly individualized, bespoke, very tactical means to develop their skills in an effective way. But we've also invested in building out a talent analytics platform so that organizations can make decisions at a strategic organizational level, at a team effectiveness level, but also at that individual leader by leader level. And so, like I mentioned, it means that because we've combined strong technology investments with behavioral sciences, we've got one of the most advanced and integrated platforms on the market today. That's a little bit about us. But the last thing I mentioned there was our investment in the talent analytics platform and making sure you've got the data you need to make those high-powered organizational and team and leader decisions. And so I'm going to turn over to Amy to take us through a little bit about what that means from a talent analytics perspective.
Thanks, Michelle. As Michelle mentioned, beyond those assessment solutions targeting selection, development, and succession planning, it is truly Pinsight's powerful talent analytics engine that puts the data in the hands of HR, talent management, and organizational development leaders to equip them with the insights to make those key talent decisions. Now, when we take a step back and look at the talent analytics as a whole, which you might also recognize by names like HR, human capital, and people analytics, it's all centered around using data to better understand the workforce, be it the current or potential workforce, to ultimately improve the quality and speed of decisions to optimize talent outcomes. Talent analytics can help us understand how businesses operate, how to improve productivity and performance, identify where there might be high risks of turnover, how to hire the best talent, and improve work for existing employees. Now, different types of analytics can give us different types of insights or predictions and vary in their levels of complexity. For instance, different descriptive and diagnostic analytics help us understand what's currently happening or what has happened to date and what are the circumstances leading up to that occurrence that help us paint a picture of the talent landscape in a bit more of a descriptive or picture painting sense, if you will. But talent analytics can become increasingly sophisticated and valuable as we think about more future-focused insights. By understanding relationships between different sources of talent data, we can make predictions about the future to understand what's likely to happen in the future, how to attain certain outcomes. And it's these types of insights that really equip HR leaders with the ability to maximize their impact and likelihood of success by removing some of that guesswork and human error and bias, by highlighting patterns within data sets and relationships that might not be readily apparent to the eye in order to better understand talent and forecast future outcomes. While some of these analytics used to be reserved for mature organizations years ago, with increasing ease of access, that means more and more organizations are turning to the power of analytics to make data-informed talent decisions in virtually every area of the business. We see insights from talent analytics being integrated into the areas of recruitment, engagement, compensation and benefits, all the way to diversity, equity, and inclusion, productivity, learning, wellness, so many more. This list is not exhaustive. And for the HR, talent management, and people strategists out there with questions like, who is likely to be successful in this leadership position? Or what learning programs will be most impactful for this group? How strong is my bench? Who should participate in this high potential program? What strengths might be missing amongst my current leadership team? It's really Pinsight's analytics and our talent analytics platform that allows HR leaders to answer these questions with confidence, make the best decisions for the business. And in order to make those high quality decisions, you have to start with high quality data, as Michelle had mentioned earlier when revisiting some of our core values.
Thanks, Amy. And speaking of high quality data, one of the questions that many people might have here is, with these new analytics, will we be collecting different types of data? And the short answer to that is no. Pinsight is already unique in the sets of data that it collects from its candidates and the leaders that use Pinsight, in that we're one of the few platforms that collects sort of a three-dimensional view of leaders already. And so it's with this data and making sure through the processes of rigorous scientific evaluation, making sure that we are constantly looking at our data sets and ensuring that these data sources are reliable and valid. We haven't needed to go and collect more data from leaders, but rather to use them in more creative and reliable ways. So where we get our data from, and for everything that we'll look at today with these new analytics, we're still coming back to these three key sources. First of all, we have high quality information from behavioral observations, direct observations of individual leaders' behaviors through the process of those simulation exercises that you know that sit on our platform as part of the Virtual Assessment Center. So it's the first source of data, and you'll see that come up when we talk about our skill gaps updates, as well as the group capability. Second source of data that we collect is also about personality metrics. And we use this personality tool to tell us a lot about somebody's individual preferences and their personality, but we can also start to combine that at a group level to see how that might shape out into climate. And then the last source of data that we collect is learning aptitude. And this is a learning test to help us really get a good measure of potential. This tells us a lot about how individuals learn, their speed of learning, how they pick up new things. And it's relevant again for future capability predictions and understanding what somebody will look like into the future, not just describing how they are today, as Amy points out. So these are the key sources of data. We're not collecting any additional data on top of this, but all of these types of aspects, from the small measures of micro behaviors to understanding sub-dimensions of personality, let us tell a number of different stories about leaders and the types of things that they can do. For example, we already have on the platform a range of ways to think about leaders at a group level or an individual level. So, for example, we can start to see how individual leaders might compare on aspects such as their readiness for leadership, or we can plot a team or an individual on their 9 box by using this talent data. We know that we can start to think a little bit more strategically about behaviours for leadership and put them on a bench strength analysis to help us determine who's going to be ready for succession at a later date. But then we all can also break that down further into behavior by behavior type of analytics, understanding the micro aspects of someone's leadership behavior. In the past 2 years, we also released the skills and motivation analytic that tells us about individuals' nature of their motivations to engage in leadership skills. But then we also contrast that with their personality and what it is that their personality contributes to their motivation for development and motivation for expression of certain skills. We understand learning agility and potential to be a part of not just capability for learning, but also interest in learning. So can someone do it versus will they do it? And then we also have analytics that break down leadership competencies, competency by competency, so that we can see how leaders compare to a global benchmark of other leaders. And so it's this process so far that's enabled us to really support many organizations around the globe with getting good quality decisions about comparisons between leaders and then also each individual leader together. But one of the things that we really understand about the nature and future of work is group dynamics. How groups come together, how groups function as a system, how groups and teams operate at a high level. And it's that thinking about the future of work and the really changing nature of team networks and team effectiveness that led us to want to invest more in different and more reliable ways of thinking about groups. And that really leads us to these new innovations coming along that we're talking about today. So it's these three innovations or these three updates that we've added and that we'll go into a deeper fashion here this morning. The first one we're talking about is climate, and you'll hear Amy talk more about this in just a moment, but this is going to help us understand how groups operate from a group personality perspective, if you will. We'll think about group capability and what this team of folks can do from a skills and potential level, but then we'll also understand the nuances a little bit more about their skill gaps. And it's these additional insights that we want to use beyond just the classic selection, promotion, and succession decisions. But really, when we start to look at our effectiveness hats, we can use these views to start to think about transformation. What kinds of intervention from a range of things that we might focus on, or even workforce planning. And so this is going to give us, with these views of capability, interaction styles, and opportunity, a way to really intervene much more as strategists rather than just assessment professionals. So with that, let's dive in. I'm sure you're all quite curious about what we're talking about when we're talking about climate, what we mean by capability, and what is it that we've done to the skills graph. So over to Amy to take us through the first of our new analytics, the climate analytics.
Thanks, Michelle. When we talk about our new climate analytics, what we're really referencing in this notion of climate is properties of a perceived work environment. These are properties that are inherently created by individuals that work among groups, and how each of those team members thinks and behaves and interacts with others really rolls into this experience of a shared climate. It's how individuals experience that work environment as a result of bringing those attitudes and behaviors to foster a greater sense of climate. And to measure this, this characteristic of a group, Pinsight turns to the measurement of the 7 key personality dimensions. While we've previously reported on individual tendencies and scores along these key 7 dimensions, what's new here is the aggregate view to build our understanding of similarities and differences, build our understanding of how individual groups show up for work, how these teams are likely to interact with one another, and again, this environment they create through those patterns of interaction, patterns of behaving, thinking, and bringing that mindset and attitude to a collective environment. Climate can ultimately impact productivity and motivation. It can establish norms for team interactions. So it's key that we build our awareness of climate to help organizations better understand how they might be able to support those teams, how they might be able to structure work around preferences in order to optimize productivity, but also impact satisfaction and employee engagement as well. So we'll dive into some of the uses of this type of data. But before we do that, let's talk about how to actually interpret some of these new views. Within Pinsight's platform, you can filter down to a specific group of individuals, and based on your kind of research question or what you might be interested in, those individuals might be based on teams, departments, or regions, high potential groups, depending on, again, that kind of research question and what type of insight you're looking to gather. You can curate the most appropriate group there to drive and derive some insights. And once you've selected that group, you'll see our new climate tab within our suite of analytics within the platform. And above each of those dimensions, you kind of see this visual overlay, which communicates a couple key characteristics about each of these groups that roll up again into this experience of climate. First, we'll see that group average score indicated by kind of the arrow or that line within the middle, giving us a quick pulse on what are some of the average or typical tendencies among this group. But averages don't always tell a complete story, right? There is certainly wide variability in some of our individual characteristics. So we also share with you where the majority of that group's scores falls. If you imagine kind of transposing that rectangle onto those colored bars there, that helps us show that we've got a great group of individuals here with scores within that moderate range on either side of the middle there. Now, depending on the shared characteristics of a group, you might see this rectangle being quite large, indicating large variability in the different perspectives that individuals bring to groups. Alternatively, you might see this bar being very condensed, very narrow, indicating high degrees of similarity. You might not always see that mean trending towards the average. You might also see individuals and groups expressing very high shared traits, either all the way towards the right or all the way towards the left, indicating some stable and innate preferences among that working group. If you were to notice some of those similarities, a narrow range or a particularly high or low average, you might then turn to looking at some of the minimum and maximum scores within that group, which help us identify any potential outliers among that group who could potentially perceive climate much differently than others in that group, or have preferences that go a little bit against the grain there in terms of the collective tendencies of the group that they might be working with. Now, finally, we get this visual indicator and numerical indicator of the number of individuals you've selected with interpretations of their scores falling within each of these particular ranges here. Now, in both cases, we're seeing a fairly normal distribution, which is what you might expect when you have large numbers of candidates as we trend towards the mean there. But as you kind of curate different groups, again, depending on the size of that group, the relationship of those individuals to one another, the implications of this data truly do depend on that group of individuals that you've curated. Now, the insights can range from more of higher level trends amongst talent across the entire organization, or we can kind of narrow down into identifying some very interactional insight amongst smaller functional teams. So as you consider what types of groups you might examine this climate information with, I'd urge you to continue to use that chat below to share some of your initial thoughts about what type of value might this provide for your organization, or how do you initially see yourself kind of digging into some of these insights. And while you're populating those thoughts, I'll go ahead and share some of our own here as we think about some of the organizational implications for climate data. Again, this list is not exhaustive, but it helps us begin to conceptualize how this data is applicable to multiple areas of organizations. At the highest level, climate data might have the potential to expose some bias in decision making. What I mean by that is, consider a specific case where a group of candidates may have made it past an initial phone screen and have been invited to participate in a Pinsight simulation. Upon looking at their scores, we might see they're kind of missing the mark in terms of their readiness for leadership. And when we take a look then at the climate analytics, we might see patterns of extremely high shared traits and potentially those dimensions of outgoing and caring. What this data would suggest then is it is possible that recruiters may have been screening for more of energy and enthusiasm and a warm attitude than they were for kind of the requisite skills for that particular role. Now, this is data that can kind of build insight around what could have been happening at that stage that we can feed back into that process to continue to refine and improve what some of those screening criteria might be to ensure that we're aligned moving forward. Now, that's just one example here, but you might also be envisioning how this type of knowledge can really equip managers to coach their teams effectively. So with an understanding of these kind of collective tendencies and attitudes and perceptions of a work environment, managers can be equipped with this understanding to kind of accommodate those different interaction styles and preferences to match the interaction styles of their teams in order to maximize coaching interactions and kind of meet those individuals where they are and where their preferences are. This can set some realistic expectations for how you might expect teams to interact with one another. And I'm sure you might be thinking of all the wonderful team dynamics interventions that could be possible with this type of insight, from building awareness of similarities and differences to ultimately inspiring and enabling deeper conversations to build understanding and appreciation for different approaches to work, which could ultimately work to enhance collaboration and maybe mitigate conflict as a result of having differing perspectives. You might envision cases where this climate data gives us some insight into a potential obstacle for group effectiveness. So to provide kind of an easy to digest example here, consider we've got a team and they score collectively low on the dimension of organization. They might create a climate where we're a little less concerned with the details, a little less bogged down in process and detail orientation. And a manager could flag that as a potential obstacle to group effectiveness, knowing that there tends to be this attitude and climate where things have the potential to maybe fall through the cracks, in which case you might consider designing some work or designing structure or processes to maybe circumvent some of those obstacles to effectiveness, in which case it could be as simple as kind of a rotating team member that is responsible for capturing those details, disseminating to the team. That's kind of a granular example there, but you can see how where we see some of those narrow ranges and consistencies among groups, we can then design work to accommodate those preferences, ultimately making work more enjoyable for others and increasing satisfaction as they're able to kind of engage in work that's aligned with those preferences. Now, one more applied example I'd like to share with you is consider the case where you're able to compare climate at different levels of the organization. So we recently worked with a Pinsight client to examine leaders within multiple levels of that organization as part of a broader development program. And looking at this slice of leadership from frontline leaders to mid-level managers and directors, we can understand and start to see some of the differences in the climate created by each of those groups. So what we observed here were some notable differences in the learning style, in the preferences and approach of each of these groups, which had previously gone unnoticed, right? So on the top here, we see directors tended to have very high scores indicating strong preference and interest in seeking out learning opportunities, which varied from middle management, which showed a little bit of mix of perspectives in terms of that interest in formal learning, as well as kind of figuring things out on their own. And both of these contrasted greatly from that frontline level of leadership, who really tended to be a group that wanted to get their hands in with a little more practical learning. Now, these differences ultimately highlight that learning initiatives targeted for each of these groups you should consider designing them a bit differently to accommodate those preferences for maximum impact, to kind of meet those employees where their preferences are, to engage and facilitate the learning amongst those groups. Now, that's just one example, one slice of data here. I'm excited to hopefully look at that chat and see some other ideas that we're getting from the audience here, but I will turn it over to Michelle to consider group capability as well.
Thanks so much, Amy. And please do continue to use the Q&A. We've got Andrew standing by answering some of those key questions. A couple of the small shout outs I want to make is that if anyone has any data sitting on the platform right now, these views are available to you. No need to take new assessments. So they are available to any of you that have data there. So let's now turn to group capability. Now, personality is obviously a really powerful insight into how one perceives themselves and how one really is conscious of showing up and demonstrating their preferences and behaviors in social groups. And so while our personality test is certainly self-report, it is certainly highly valid. Now, personality, as Amy says, can really give us a lot of views into individual style of preferences. And when we put that together, we can start to see trends in how groups might behave and their natural aptitudes and abilities. But when we want to think about what does that mean ultimately for how they demonstrate their skills and what they're capable of, climate doesn't always give us everything that we might be curious about when it comes to what skills people might have mastered in spite of their preferences. It doesn't necessarily tell us where they are today, or maybe even what their potential is for growth, being that while I might have a very strong personality or climate towards one thing, it might also suggest, or some data might suggest, I'm also a fast learner and can pick up new things. So while climate is certainly a reflective of a stable trait, we can also see that there can be a difference in people's personalities to their capability. And that's what this next analytic is telling us. When we're thinking about group capability and we're thinking about what this is, we can start to define this in more clear details. So what we're calling group capability is what we're talking about is about the group average, or the average of the group's performance. So how do we see the skills of the group on average compared to the potential for that group, the average group potential. So this is where we're starting to see this comparison or this contrast of what the natural aptitude of a group is and what they're currently achieving. Basically, this new analytic tells us, what is this group capable of? This analytic is being fed by a number of other analytics that we've talked about earlier. Firstly, that's self-report personality dimensions taken in aggregate. Also taking the learning agility tool, or I should say the learning agility data that tells us about how quickly and naturally and easily learning new things, learning new skills comes. It takes into account how challenging some of these leadership skills can be just in general, some of them being more difficult, some of them being more easy for the general population. But then it compares that idea of potential with what we're actually seeing demonstrated in the behavioral observations from the simulation. Because you can appreciate, in my personal situation, very highly extroverted. Much of my team will be very much from a climate perspective, high on the extroversion scale, which suggests that sometimes the capability for active listening is not always coming naturally. Now, my hope is that over 20 years of practice and attention and a relatively okay learning aptitude, that my skill for active listening has been able to overcome my natural inclination to use my mouth in disproportion to my ears. Those that know me will know that's true. But why would we be interested in this? Why do we want to understand what this group is capable of? Obviously, it tells us a lot about where we've got optimal performance from a group. How do we see this team? How do we see even a whole organization through the optimal sweet spot of being working right at that point of meeting capability? We might also be concerned when there's a group that's perhaps overextended, working outside of their potential or natural preferences, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Or we can get really excited where we can see a group that maybe we're concerned about, but we actually find that there's plenty of potential to be unlocked, and that has some significant implications for how we might intervene on a number of levels. So I'll show you what this analytic looks like, point out a couple of where these details show up, and then we'll also reflect again on how we might consider this from a practitioner perspective. Okay, so what does this group capability analytic look like? When you're looking inside the platform and you're looking at individuals that have taken the same assessment, you'll be able to see them on this group capability view now. So for those of us that are joining us as administrators of their Pinsight account, and those that have access, you'll simply select people that have done the same type of assessment. That is, they've had the same types of skills evaluated, and you'll be able to see this. What we're looking at here is, again, the difference between the average group performance and the capability. So let's then look at what these first bars look like. These colored bars tell us about the average of the skill performance for the group. That is, when we take everybody's scores on active listening, for example, and we draw out that group average, we can see where they're sitting at the high performance. So high performance for Pinsight, once again, means that they're scoring at the above average level, above the norm. We're seeing them sitting well and truly above the 67th percentile compared to a global benchmark group. We're seeing high performance here compared to what we would expect of the usual leader. We can see that those yellow bars are in that average or moderate or medium level of performance, and those blue bars reflecting a lower performance. So right out of the gate here, we can see that this group of regional directors has a distribution of skills, some of them very strong, some of them moderate, one of them low, as a collective group. Now, the next thing that we see here in this chart is the gray bars that sit behind it. And what these gray bars are telling us is what's the skill potential for this group. When we bring all together the views about that, inform potential from the climate of this group, the personality metrics of this group, when we think about how this group is functioning from a learning aptitude perspective, their interests and also their skills to learn new things, and then also how challenging these skills can be generally, that's where we get this gray bar that tells us about what's the low to medium to high level of potential for this group. And then lastly, we can see over on the side here that the x-axis is telling us about the percentiles, okay? So where in some of the other analytics that Amy was just showing us, and we saw some numbers there, that was telling us about population numbers. Over here, we're seeing this is this percentile group. So anything below the 34 point there, that's below the 34th percentile, that's where we're falling in that low range. Anything between 34 and 67 is falling in the average or the mediate range. And then anything above 67 is falling in the high performance range, and an unusually high score. So one of the other things that will show up for you in the group capability view is giving you the ability to look at this in a more granular fashion. So at the bottom of the graph, when you are looking at these analytics online in your Pinsight platform, you'll be able to see this data more clearly. You'll be able to see those numbers in a very crisp fashion. Right over onto the left here, we can see that the average group performance, we can see those numbers sitting there. We can also see in a crisp numerical fashion the average group potential over on the far right. And for those of you that are noticing, hey, what's this average group improvement? This is where we're seeing how this group is growing and advancing and meeting their potential by their engagement in the Pinsight app. So this is going to tell us a lot more about where the growth is happening for this group and what they're growing into and how they're really maximizing their potential. Okay, so these are the views that you're starting to get when you're looking at this analytic. But like Amy mentioned before, I'm curious to hear, what do you maybe perceive might be some of the strategic uses for this information? Now, with my practitioner hat on, I can start to think about how I might think about this in some very interesting ways, from a sort of an organizational strategy level, from a team design level, but also from a more individualized level. And so if you've got some immediate ideas about how you might, as a practitioner, want to use this data or what you would be curious about, go ahead and share that in the chat. But I'll give you some of my perspective or our perspective on what we started to think about could be very curious and important when thinking about intervention and transformation. The first thing I think about is strategically building a strategy around skills. Now, this is really where you're thinking about as a senior executive, when we're thinking about, what is our competitive advantage? What is our real business strategy to be competitive in the market? When we build our strategy, sometimes that can really happen by having a very outward look at the marketplace that we're in. We're looking for opportunities and gaps in the market, and we build our strategy around that. But organizational strategists also know they need to very quickly or in parallel refer to the nature of the types of skills that are sitting inside an organization. That strategy execution is only as strong as the skills you have sitting inside your people at the time. And that there's an opportunity to make sure organizational strategy is married with organizational capability. And that's, I think, one of the critical views here. I can think of and have already seen data sets where organizations have a desire to be some of the most innovative, an innovative organization. That means the skills they need to have and the capability and potential they need to have inside the leaders of the organization need to be centered around innovation. Now, that's really going to be quite challenging if the organization quickly discovers that the current performance and the potential for innovation and innovation type skills is quite low or below average. That means that therefore the organization either needs to really rethink its strategy, or my second point here is to increase capability inside the organization. But you might also have the fortunate advantage of also doing this type of analysis with a large group of leaders and quickly see that, in fact, our leaders are equipped with some very above average, very strong skills around customer centricity. Now, this could also then mean the organization could quickly pivot and make some big moves into being a very competitive organization that has higher customer service or customer centricity than its competitors. You can quickly see now that by taking some of these viewpoints, we can see how capability really has to be an important marriage with organizational strategy, or some of these interventions might be important. The second intervention point here is about increasing capability through the reorganization or potentially some workforce planning. A question might be raised about who we're hiring, how we're identifying potential for certain skills, and ensuring that, once again, that our hiring strategy and our development strategy is in lockstep with what our business strategy and our organizational plans are. So this might therefore mean, from a reorganization perspective, the differences between thinking about interventions such as job design for certain teams. It may look at restructuring certain teams. It might look like restructuring aspects of the organization, where some groups will be led more effectively by different departments or different leader types. So we can consider that aspect as well as an intervention. And obviously, workforce planning or recruitment style and strategy could be very much impacted by this view. We also want to think about establishing expectations for skill expression. And you could appreciate that we might have situations where we've got some leaders that are potentially overextended in their expression of certain skills. So we saw on the previous graph, we had leaders that are performing above their natural potential. This might sound exciting on the surface, but we want to manage the risk of that, where we may have leaders engaging in types of work or in types of projects or in types of functions that's beyond their natural potential. That is, they may feel overextended, lead to burnout, or have troubles or of risk of turnover if we don't start to maybe reset some expectations. Similarly, we may have leaders that are underperforming in their types of skills, where we have unleashed potential. And now with this set of data, we can make much more data-informed development planning decisions about how we might therefore optimize the group, how we might go about unlocking that potential and really resetting some expectations from a development perspective and also a managerial perspective. And this is really what we saw with our example that Amy was showing us a moment earlier, where we had a group of supervisors that showed us from a climate perspective that they were more, had preference for more practical hands-on learning types. Now, interestingly, this is what we're seeing here in the group capability for these supervisors. And when we look inside the organization, or when we were working with this organization, they were very quick to say that the organization had invested a lot of time and effort and energy around mentorship and coaching. And this group here in this organization of the supervisors, we can actually quickly see there's a very strong level of potential for them to be managing priorities, creating urgency, and making customer-centric types of decisions. So this information coupled with climate information gives us an incredible blueprint about how managers might start to unlock this potential. So with practical, more hands-on learning, opportunities for stretch assignments, and maybe also changing some expectations about what this group is capable of, we can see this group growing into a way that they can be managing priorities, making customer-centric decisions, and driving execution much more than they have been at the moment. One example, but now let me turn over now to Amy, because while we're also just looking at capability from a group perspective here, one might be asking, well, does everyone have a below average level of performance in priorities, or is this just a couple of people? So coming back to Amy for the updated skill graphs.
Just as Michelle stated, this is where we get some of that deeper insight into the distribution of skills. So we've updated our skill gap view to be able to more quickly see some of that insight, to gather where there are concentrations of strengths or areas of opportunity. When we think about how Pinsight considers a skill gap, we consider a skill gap to exist in areas where individuals are scoring below or at average relative to that global benchmark. So in other words, where it's not really emerging as a crystal clear strength, there is opportunity for continued development there. And when we think about skill gaps for a group, we're highlighting kind of those shared opportunities to strengthen skills and what that distribution of skills looks like within the group. These skill gap views in our understanding of leaders' current capability to engage in these key leadership behaviors is informed by, again, that performance score by behavioral observation throughout the simulations, where leaders, we're not making any speculations here. Leaders really had the opportunity to show us what they're capable of today and enact those skills throughout the duration of that simulation. Now, the skills gap view can also be dynamic in the sense that we've got an opportunity to feed back improvement scores from the Pinsight app, from leaders' continued daily practice of small leadership behaviors. We can start to feed that data back in to visualize how those gaps are reduced over time as a result of that continued practice. And I'll show an example here in a moment. This particular updated view is highly impactful for those learning and development specialists and strategists out there who can get this quick view into a group needs analysis for kind of the developmental themes amongst this group, and identify some of those group strengths as well. Very quickly, we see here that distribution of strengths amongst the measured skills for this particular simulation. We can start to see how that kind of shapes up or kind of fleshes out amongst this group, and looking where there might be concentrations of individuals scoring in that low range versus those where they might be scoring a bit higher. A few things to call out in this particular updated view is that as vertical axis here, you'll always get a sense of the total number of individuals that you've selected as this group of participants to examine. We'll also get that numerical indicator showing how many individuals were showing low, again, that below average, or medium within that average range relative to the benchmark, or high above average skills for each of these critical leadership skill areas. Finally, these skills are ordered from left to right based on the largest number of individuals showing lower performance scores for that particular area. So very quickly, we get this visual insight with some of our larger gaps for this group showing up on the left-hand side of the graph, and some of the kind of strengths amongst this group showing up on the right-hand side. So in the particular example on the screen here, while communicate clearly for make good decisions, we've got two individuals in this group who are really excelling. These are some of their superpowers, some of the strengths that they bring to this group. Initially, those might look like the size of the gap or the severity of that gap is similar, but we're actually seeing there's differential numbers here of individuals who score in that below average range versus that average range, which has some implications for how we might interpret and make decisions based on this particular view. What I mean by that is we can understand again, that size and severity of those skill gaps in order to prioritize development. In that way, in the example that I had provided earlier, the way that we might approach development in each of those areas might depend on the current level of expertise or competence, capability today. For groups that might be scoring on average, a little bit in that lower range, we might consider implementing some knowledge-based programming, specifically targeting helping these individuals build awareness of what it looks like to demonstrate this particular skill, what it sounds like, where you might use this skill. For groups that might be inexperienced in that particular area, jumping into kind of applied learning might be too far a jump for that group given their distribution of skills amongst the group. You might consider how this skills gap view, if individuals took it upon entry to a developmental program, are retested upon exit of that developmental program, we might begin to see how skill gaps are closing, to demonstrate kind of the return on investment in that development program, and see how groups of leaders are establishing stronger skills by the point of exit at that program. You might also consider some opportunities for peer coaching, where we see maybe there's a group of 10 individuals, 5 of which demonstrate a particular strength very strongly, and another subset of that group who demonstrate that skill with less competence or comfort or natural ease, in which case you might consider opportunities for peer mentorship to have these individuals work and team together to really reflect on their current practices that are effective, to expand and refine and share some of those ideas to build new skills. Now, these are just some ideas that can kind of operate outside and in conjunction with the Pinsight platform, but I want to show an example of how that skill gaps view can be dynamic based on usage of the Pinsight app. So in a group of leaders within an educational institution that participated in Pinsight as part of a development program, they were provided the Pinsight app for ongoing skill development after their participation in the program. And this app, again, took those results from each of their assessment results to roll that up into a data-informed, personalized development plan. Excitingly, what we're able to see from the platform is comparing the point of simulation to now today, after days of repeated continued skill practice, we're actually seeing this group of leaders in this educational institution reduce and close some of these skill gaps, right? So before, at the point of simulation, we see that there are just 7 individuals who are demonstrating communicate clearly at an above average level relative to that global benchmarking group. And after we're able to feed back in that improvement data, we're now seeing the large majority of that group showing that particular skill as a strength, showing us exactly where they've been focusing their development, exactly where this group of leadership is now more and better equipped to execute these skills and bring value back to that educational institution. I'll go ahead and turn it over to Michelle now to bring us full circle and talk through some of the practical applications.
Thanks, Amy. I'll do this one really quickly, but I did want to be able to show you how some of these analytics might come together to provide some very strategic interventions for an organization that we worked with in the last few months. So the context with this specific organization was we were working with a leader of a new department in a large government organization. And the issue that they wanted to solve was they wanted to be able to build a new department with optimum leadership success, but they were very concerned about which role to put which person in and whether they were going to be capable. They were concerned about making those best decisions to ensure they were successful, but they also knew that there was going to be selection decisions that needed to be made, but they also wanted to be able to see potential in their leaders and build the optimal development plans as well. And in the context of this situation that we were dealing with, they were choosing from an internal pool of candidates. So we were sort of seeing a kind of a subset of leaders that were selected into the potential to join this new department. Because that was the problem that we were trying to solve, we absolutely recommended using Pinsight to measure and understand and gain insights about the talent pool that we were working with. And it was going to help us identify those leaders that were ready to step into those key roles. But we also wanted to see more data than just who was ready now. We also wanted to understand who was going to be best equipped to take which role based on their skills and potential. But we also wanted to make sure that we were using very data-informed onboarding plans to accelerate their time of readiness to make sure that they were working well. Let me show you a couple of the outputs that we saw and some of the key insights that we drew all together, and then where we landed at the end of that intervention. The first thing we looked at was their 9-box analytic to understand what this pool looked like. And we could very quickly see that for this group of leaders, they were above average in their potential, but they were very much below average on their current level of performance of leadership skills that were identified for key performance success. And it told us that there was going to be an urgent focus on closing the experience gap and closing the performance gap for this group. But we wanted to understand more than that and start to think about their capabilities. So what these capability aspects were looking at, where were these performance and potential scores coming from? And so what we saw here was that this group of leaders was actually a group that, while performing in a very underdeveloped way, they did show significant potential and in some instances the opportunity to be very strong in some of their skill areas. But it was concerning for us to see this differential between potential and current level of performance in this pool, and had us asking questions about cultural norms and whether there was some skills and leadership behaviors that were being suppressed in this organization, or what kind of opportunities to perform and grow and operate at a more operational level of leadership were being presented, when it appeared that many of the skills that were in development still were much more at that very tactical, introductory level of leadership. So we were scratching our head here and we wanted to know more. So we dug down even further and we looked at the skill gaps analytics. And then again, we were starting to see that even where there were large skill gaps, there were some leaders that were starting to demonstrate average or above average levels of performance. But it did also tell us that the leadership pipeline, the opportunity for leaders to go from frontline to mid-level to senior level of leadership, was showing cracks. We were concerned here for this organization that amongst this pool, many of them were not ready to advance into more senior and more strategic levels of leadership. And then when we wanted to understand a little bit more about the nuance and the type of person that we were looking at here, this is where we went to climate. And we could see very quickly that this group of leaders were very ambitious. They were a resilient group that could handle more stress and capability and enjoyed a challenge. And they were also a group that was very interested in learning. So on average, this group of leaders, while performing at a low level, were the types of leaders that had the desire, the interest, and the cognitive horsepower to grow into great leaders ahead. So this told us once again that there were some issues going on here that this group of leaders maybe were being challenged with. So beyond just making those initial recommendations about who to select and how to select those individuals, we also went back to the organization that with some very clear recommendations about data-based, highly individualized development plans to unlock their potential. We could understand at an individual level what needed to happen, but it also gave us data to go back to the organization to say how their leadership development programs might be improved overall, where the programming that they needed should sit, how mentorship or coaching programs could operate well within this sort of organization, and what kind of ROI they should expect. Further, this data gave us information to go back to the business to say that it was important to have a look at the talent development and retention needs for this group, that there was evidence that perhaps leaders weren't being developed and engaged with opportunities to grow, and that that could provide them with some challenges in retention later on. Further, we also gave a recommendation to the organisation that it was important to identify and optimise and improve the processes whereby leaders were selected into talent pools for advancement later on. Not that we thought that there was a problem necessarily with just the process, but that leaders were going to be ill-equipped to jump into more advanced roles and find themselves with struggles, again, around retention and performance. So that just gives you sort of a high level sort of overlook of how we've sort of thought about some of these analytics to provide much more strategic insight beyond just the classic ways we've been thinking about talent analytics in the past. I am aware that we have just gone over time, and so I'm going to wrap up and summarize for us some of these key takeaways and where we really encourage you to go next. Amy, over to you for those key takeaways.
As you've seen, these wonderful new views really expand the types of strategic uses, interventions, and the workforce plans you might be able to develop as a result of this new dynamic view into groups of talent. We've talked about them at length, so what I really want to call out for you is to get into the platform, look at your data. This has been retroactively enabled for admins and stakeholders within the platform, so get in and begin to derive some insight from these particular groups that you already have in the platform. Be sure to check out that knowledge base for any answers to questions, but engage stakeholders, share this data, these new views with them. Be sure to continue to invite them to the platform and enable these analytics in future customizations. To be able to show them these aggregate group views. If you want to talk more deeply about your specific data sets and trends or other uses, please reach out to your Pinsight representative. And if you're interested in learning more about Pinsight's leadership solutions and analytics platforms, we'll have a poll coming up where you can request here very shortly.
Thank you so much. And I know that we are absolutely at time. And so I am just going to ask for your brief feedback to make sure that we're always designing useful and helpful content for you. As I mentioned, this is just one of our Pinsight in Practice series. And so we absolutely are grateful for your feedback in making sure that these sessions are powerful and useful, and how we can make sure that they are useful to you. Similarly, if you would like more information about how to apply this, how to work with this practically, Amy does point out that there are a number of knowledge base articles on our website available for you to help navigate those ones, but we'd be delighted to reach out to you. Thank you everyone for joining us today. I'll stop the recording here.